Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Perkins, a science writer and press officer at Caltech. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Conversations on Artificial Intelligence, the Future of Personalized Medicine. This series is hosted by the Caltech Science Exchange and gives us a chance to hear from scientists and engineers who are working on the cutting edge of AI and machine learning. I'm joined today by Azita Emami, Caltech's Andrew and Peggy Cherng Professor of Electrical Engineering and Medical Engineering, and the director for the Center for Sensing to Intelligence. So AI has the potential to usher in a new era of personalized medicine by improving diagnosis and treatment through sensing, analyzing, and responding to the data our bodies generate through brain signals, sweat, and more. Azita Emami has generated a number of medical devices aimed at improving health outcomes that incorporate AI. Azita, thanks you so much for being here.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I would like to also welcome everyone to this webinar.
Thank you. So let's get started. The promise of personalized medicine always seems to be just around the corner, but never quite here for the masses. Can you first explain what personalized medicine means, and then what some of the requirements are going to be to make it a reality?
Sure. Personalized medicine, or also known as sometimes as precision medicine, refers to medical therapies, predictions, or even preventions that are carefully tailored to a particular individual. And in fact, it has been around for quite some time, but not very broadly. An early example of precision medicine that has been around for almost 2 decades is breast cancer treatment, where patients receive chemotherapy based on certain gene expression. And in fact, genotyping cancer cells to determine if certain chemotherapy works is one of the most advanced examples of personalized medicine today. But the promise of personalized medicine has been much bigger and broader. And the hope is to use not only genetic information, but also to include data from a variety of sources, different biomarkers, history of the patient, images, and data from wearable and implantable devices that can continuously monitor patients. And the hope is to use all these data from different sources and apply it to a broader set of conditions beyond cancer and chemotherapy. So I think you asked also what it takes or what are the tools that we need.
Yeah.
So there are, of course, things on the medical side, but some of the engineering or data science part of it that comes to my mind is, first of all, we need to generate very high quality data that can be used for many, many individuals, perhaps over years. And we need devices and imaging systems that can generate this. Similar to genetics that is now very advanced, we need the same type of advancement for other data sources. And we need to include many individuals to collect data. And finally, we need algorithms and data science approaches that can handle this complex set of data.
So how will artificial intelligence or machine learning play a role in this?
So as I mentioned, the hope is that we collect data from many different sources, sensors, imagers, genetic information, history of the patients, and also we collect it from many, many different people, different ages, gender, you name it. So as you can imagine, this is a very complex problem that we have to correlate this complex set of data to different conditions, and also perhaps we want to predict whether a patient is at higher risk. And in fact, this is a place that machine learning and AI can play a huge role, because now we are at a place that we have deep learning algorithms that can be trained with huge data sets to help us predict or make better decisions. So I believe AI and ML are going to play a huge role in this pursuit. Also, another area that AI and ML can be very helpful for precision medicine is if we embed machine learning into wearable and implantable devices, that we can actually very quickly, we can train these algorithms and to the baseline of the patients and also to other patients' data that we have, and basically use these devices to very quickly predict problems or detect conditions that can be dangerous. So that's another aspect of AI that can be used for personalized medicine.
Excellent. All right. So can you give us a brief overview of the research that goes on in your lab and when you started incorporating AI methods?
Sure. So in general, in my lab, we are interested in biomedical devices, for instance, sensors and the drug delivery systems or navigation tools for surgeries, for precision surgeries. So we build tiny devices that can be implanted. They are usually wireless, batteryless, and we try to make them as non-invasive as possible. So I've been working in this domain very soon after I arrived to Caltech in 2007. But I always wanted to work in the domain of neural interfaces. And one of the reasons was that one of my sisters suffers from epilepsy. And from very early, when she was a child, I could observe that this was very difficult for her. There were side effects of the drugs, and sometimes drugs were not very successful in controlling her condition. So that was something very close to my heart, and I always wanted to work in this domain. And I was very lucky, about 6 years ago or so, I could start working on seizure detection or early seizure detection or prediction for patients who have epilepsy. Because there are about 1/3 of patients with epilepsy who cannot take advantage of drugs. Drugs do not work on them very well. And there are a subset of them that if we predict the seizure early enough, we can perform deep brain stimulation to stop the seizure. So that was kind of my first project. That was a closed loop system that involved huge amount of data. Basically, we were looking at collected neural data from electrodes, electrodes under the skull, intracranial electrodes. And the goal was to, before the symptoms of the seizure arrives, we can predict it from the signature of the neural data. Wow. So as you can imagine, this can be very patient dependent. But the nice thing about epilepsy is that there are large data sets available publicly. And first, we built systems that are more signal processing. We use the technique called compressed sensing to reduce the complexity of data processing. But then we quickly realized that we need an adaptive system that can learn from the data sets and is more adaptive and kind of more personalized for each patient. So at that point was a turning point for us, and very naturally we observed the limitations of more conventional signal processing approaches, and we start using learning algorithms, and we could successfully show that we could train a network, in fact decision trees, to very reliably, in a very hardware efficient way, predict the seizure early enough to stop it, and we tested it in mice. One of our goals was to make this device highly energy efficient, to be able to make an implantable device that a patient can use. So this was kind of the beginning of using AI in my group, but now we have extended that effort to new brain-machine interfaces, and also we have new projects that we are adding machine learning algorithms for heart monitoring to wearable devices.
Excellent. Okay. Well, can you tell us a little bit about more of your research in creating these brain-machine interfaces? I mean, what problems, you talked a little bit about them, seizures and heart issues. What big picture problems are you hoping to tackle with this?
So one of the projects that right now we are very excited about is in collaboration with Professor Richard Anderson, who has pioneered brain-machine interfaces and has been working in this domain for many years. Many of you and our audience, I'm sure, know him. So the goal is for patients who have a spinal cord injury to implant electrodes in certain regions of the brain, and then use decoding algorithms to predict their intention as they think about moving a robotic arm or moving a cursor on a screen. So after working on the seizure prediction systems, and when Cherng Institute for Neuroscience started at Caltech, there was an opportunity for me to start collaborating with Professor Richard Anderson. And in our discussions with him, first of all, we realized that there is no small implantable device right now. Patients are connected to large wires and computers, and it's a system that is not mobile at all. They have to sit in the clinic and use the system. So that was one goal, to see if we can implement it in a tiny chip, and also to improve the performance of it. There were a lot, in our discussions, we realized that there are a lot of non-stationary effects. Things change day to day. So the reliability and the performance of the system has a lot more room to improve. So that kind of started our conversations and our collaborations, and we've been working with Richard and his group for almost 3 years now, and we have made a lot of progress, and we're very interested in continuing that research.
You kind of walk us through how that works, in particular your collaboration with Dr. Anderson. How does the brain-machine interface work, and how does that then go from the patient's brain to the action happening on the screen?
Sure, that's a great question. So we have penetrating electrodes that remarkably they can pick up signals, the small electric signals as neurons fire. And so neurons are constantly firing. We have a huge number of electrodes, and we have multiple arrays in the brain, and we collect the data. Currently, the analog data goes through amplifiers to a module that gets digitized, and the data is, of course, very noisy. It's a huge amount of data. So the next step is a lot of pre-processing of the data and filtering of the data. And then we go to a feature extraction unit, which we basically find that, okay, a neuron has fired, and we use, conventionally, people in most systems use threshold crossing, meaning that they set a threshold. If the neural activity goes above that, we count it as one spike. And then in a given bin, we measure how many spikes we have. And that's kind of the traditional way of defining a feature that maps kind of the measurements to neural activity. And this firing rate in this given amount of time is sent to a decoder. And then the decoder decides, after setting the parameters of the decoder decides what direction, for instance, the patient wants to move a cursor.
Mm-hmm. You know, it sounds like science fiction, but it also sounds like you're already testing this in humans. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely, we have done that. Of course, Professor Anderson had done this many years ago with patients that have had the electrodes for many years. But we have also developed new algorithms that we have shown that significantly improve the performance of brain-machine interfaces using machine learning algorithms. And in fact, we have a video that we can play, and it shows, so this is a double-blind study. Decoder A is the traditional way of decoding the information and doing feature extraction using threshold crossing. So as you can see, the patient is successful with moving from the center to one of the circles. Now, decoder B is our decoder, and as you can see, is much faster, more straight, and overall, it is much easier for the patient to control this. So the nice thing is that this patient, actually, the performance of his electrodes was not that good, and it was going down, and there were plans of removing the electrodes, but with our new algorithm, he's excited to continue using the electrodes.
You talk us through what the difference between the old algorithm and the new algorithm is, how you've managed to achieve this improvement?
So there are two parts to it. First, we focused on the decoding algorithm. So in the past, people have been using, for instance, Kalman filters and other variations of Kalman filters. So we started looking into neural networks. We first tested existing neural networks, for instance, recurrent neural networks. And we actually showed that just by using threshold firing rate and feeding into neural networks, we already achieved better performance. But my student, Benjamin Haki, also started looking into using the domain knowledge and coming up with better neural networks that can improve the performance. So he created variations of these recurrent neural networks by adding memory and additional states to the system. And by doing that, we showed that we can improve the performance. The way that it works is we use the existing recorded data, we train the neural network, and then we go to a new session. They may do additional fine-tuning, training at the beginning of the session, and then the patient uses the system that is a neural network-based system rather than a Kalman filter-based system. So that was one of our first approaches and improvements that this work was published about 2-3 years ago. Then we realized that just by looking at threshold crossing, we are losing a lot of information because there are a lot of rich information in the neural data, in the broadband neural data. So we first started using existing feature extraction techniques like wavelet transforms. People who know signal processing are familiar with that. It's like you can think of Fourier transform, one way of feature extraction, or you can think of a wavelet transform as another way. So we showed that with wavelet transform, we can extend the performance over a longer period of time. And finally, by that observation, it led us to using learning algorithms to create even features and not just use threshold crossing. And that has shown a huge improvement recently, as you saw in the video.
You talked about using a recurrent neural network, and my apologies if you've already done this, but can you explain to us what that is?
So recurrent neural networks are a type of neural networks similar to feed-forward neural networks. Maybe you have seen the image of it. There are many layers. There are different nodes that the data, there is a nonlinear element into it. But recurrent neural network, the difference is that they keep track of the history. For instance, when in languages, you need to use something like recurrent neural network or LSTM, which is long short-term memory neural networks that can keep track of a certain amount of memory in them. And recurrent neural networks are similar to those.
Okay. And what are some of the benefits of using these? You said obviously there's an improvement in performance. What else?
So one of the biggest advantages have been the fact that it improves the longevity of the system. system, meaning that, and stability of the system. So when we are looking at threshold crossing, our hypothesis is that every electrode is picking the closest neuron in the system that is close to the electrode. And it doesn't listen to the neighboring neurons. But when we look at better feature extraction techniques, we are not only listening to a neuron that is close to a given electrode, but also we are listening to the neighboring neurons. And imagine if there are micro movements that is always happening in our brain. So we may, a neuron may drop off and we cannot hear it anymore, but we are still hearing the neighboring neurons. And so our hypothesis is that by avoiding just doing threshold crossing, we are basically increasing the stability of the system when we have micro movements in the electrodes. And also if electrodes are degrading over time, we are still picking signals that we can extract information from them. So that's why we have shown that like a lot of these patients have to remove the electrode. They go and remove the electrode after 4 or 5 years, but we have shown that by using better algorithms and this type of learning algorithms, we can extend the lifetime of the electrodes.
Will it also help to get those patients out of the clinic where that's the only place they can take advantage of this? Is this marching us closer to having something they could use on a daily basis?
Exactly. So our goal has been also to come up with more hardware efficient techniques that we can implement on integrated circuit platforms, CMOS platforms that are very low cost, and be able to make them either wearable with a small battery or even completely implantable. And then the patient can use it in daily basis rather than just in the clinic.
I see. You've talked a little bit about this already, but can you talk a bit about how your process or your approach to tackling this problem has evolved over time?
Yeah, definitely. It has been very naturally happening. It has never been because like everybody is doing AI or machine learning. For us, is that because we've been dealing with large data sets, we've been dealing with very noisy data sets that are difficult to perform signal processing. So we've been step by step getting to a point that we realize, okay, this is a place that now the best is to use learning algorithms. Because if sometimes I'm also a hardware designer, sometimes if you have a model of the system that basically you can model what output you get for a given input, you can build a very customized system that is very efficient. So you don't need neural networks. But when you have large data sets, and it is very difficult to model the system, then neural networks can help significantly.
Right on. So where do you see this going in 10, 20 years? Where will the technology be?
That's a great question. So there are still a lot to be done. The system, so far we've been focusing on, for instance, feature engineering and decoding, but there is also the electrode arrays themselves that we need better electrodes that are less invasive. We also, after the electrodes, there is an analog front-end system that we basically need to amplify the signals, filter it and digitize it. So all of these still are not at a place that we can integrate everything together and create a very low power, energy efficient system. So there's a lot left to miniaturize things, to make it less invasive, to make it more robust against variations. Another thing that I forgot to mention is that still at the beginning of each session, a lot of the brain-machine interface systems need training. So the patient needs to, at the very beginning, train the system and adjust the parameters. So our goal is to try and come up with systems that can basically learn real time basically use online learning or unsupervised learning, that the system adjusts itself automatically. It learns as the patient uses the device and adjusts things gradually over time. So that's a big challenge. Another area that I think is quite important is to create systems that are low cost and people can use everywhere, and can go beyond certain smaller studies that we have.
Yeah, to sort of drill down on that, I mean, from the patient's perspective, how do we see things in the future? Do you envision a future where a patient might just have this implanted all the time? And would they be controlling not just something on a computer screen? What will it look like for somebody who would use one of these devices?
Yeah, that's a great question. The video that you saw was the simplest task to move something from the center. It's called center out task. So we have also done similar studies for grids. Basically, we have many of these dots in grids, and then we light up different points and the patient can move things around. So still we would like to get better speed and responsivity, but eventually, like, patients are like, imagine they can play even video games or control things in a very complex environment, hopefully one day. So that's another goal, to add complexity to the system and eventually help them to use it for a variety of tasks, and perhaps controlling a robotic arm very precisely and with high precision.
Wow. All right. What I know you're focused on, as you said, seizures and folks who are need to control things without using their hands. What other conditions or illnesses might this technology be applied to in the future?
So one thing that we have looked at it a little bit, not too much, has been after the seizure detection. We also looked at the Parkinson's disease, and you know that deep brain stimulation has been very successful for controlling the tremors that the patients feel. So, but a lot of these systems just continuously stimulate. So there is no harm, but there are some side effects has been observed when this is happening. So we looked at combining different data from the patient, and we used learning algorithms to predict when is the best time to stimulate instead of constantly stimulate. So again, you predict that the tremor is coming, and then before it happens, you can do stimulation. So that's more of an adaptive stimulation for Parkinson's disease that can be very helpful and life-changing for patients. So that's another example of neural interfaces that can have machine learning algorithms embedded in them.
That's fantastic. Well, at this point, I think we'll start taking some questions from the audience, if that's all right. Let me see what we've got here. So what do you think the most difficult task for AI would be in dealing with medical applications? What are the hard challenges that it would face?
That's a great question. First of all, I'm not a physician, but I have talked to many physicians about this. So in medicine, the stakes are very high. So it's life and death, and we need very reliable algorithms if we want to rely on AI. And that requires, this is a new thing, and similar to medical devices or drugs that require FDA approvals, this kind of algorithms are also starting to have requirements from FDA. FDA is constantly looking into this and setting requirements and regulations for algorithms, as well as the traditional therapy approaches. So making these systems really reliable and robust is extremely important. There are certain applications like brain-machine interfaces that if you make a mistake is not a huge deal. If you move the cursor a little bit to the wrong direction. But if you want to really move towards personalized medicine and get predictions or suggestions from AI, we really need to prove that the system is reliable. And for that, we need, as I mentioned before, huge data sets from many, many individuals. We need studies to prove that the system is robust and giving us useful information.
You know, to go on that earlier point you brought up, how many years could it take for these technologies to get FDA approval? And I think a lot of the questions we're seeing are like, how is it going to get from the lab or the clinic out to the broad world?
That's a great question. So there are certain applications that they're predicates, and so they're easier. Already FDA has approved them, and you show the similarities between what you have done and what has been approved in the past. There are certain applications that gets expedited FDA approvals if they are impacting a certain group of the society in a very meaningful way. But overall, it takes time and it's expensive. Usually there are a lot of animal studies first and then human studies, and the human studies require FDA approvals. In terms of brain-machine interfaces, we've been lucky to work with Professor Anderson. The system setup that he has has FDA approval, and it's an NIH clinical, is part of an NIH clinical study. So definitely it usually takes a long time. It takes sometimes more than 5 years that you can collect enough data and you show that the system is safe to finally get it into humans.
Okay. And then to ask you about the devices themselves, it seems like, first of all, to use AI, you'd need to have a lot of processing power, but we're also talking about having a device that's small enough to be implantable. So is that processing power on the device itself, or are you sending the information out of the device to be processed elsewhere and then sent back to the device?
That's a very good question. So right now, part of, like, we are not doing the analog amplification and analog to digital conversion. That part is done in a commercialized system that is FDA approved, because that part kind of interfaces with the patient.
Right.
But the data that we get, this is called, the company's BlackRock is famous in neural systems. But then we get the digital data, and right now we are building a chip that all the rest of the processing, including neural networks and feature extraction, will be on a single chip. So we had one chip that had only the neural network for decoding. Right now we are also building another chip that is performing feature extraction. And then the next step would be to bring all of this on a single chip. And that's one of the expertise of my group. The nice thing is that the power consumption for signal processing, as CMOS technology has scaled, has gone down significantly. So we are getting closer and closer to performing the computation all on edge. So this is called edge computing. Of course, we cannot have deep neural networks that are required for many applications on a single chip. So that's very difficult. But our goal is to come up with simpler neural networks that they still give us very good accuracy, but we can implement it on a single chip.
Wow. All right. And then will these devices be wireless and batteryless, or do you have some sort of a battery that can last for a long time, or one that can be swapped out easily? How will it be for the patients?
That's also a very good question. So for neural interfaces, we are still at the beginning. We are trying to build the system, the algorithm. We are trying to make them very, very power efficient and in a way that we can eventually wirelessly power them up. So we envision that we will have the chip kind of close maybe under the skin or just under the skull, and then the patient can have a patch externally with a wireless antenna that we can wirelessly power up the device. We have done this in the past. For instance, my group, we have worked on glucose, injectable glucose sensors that we inject right under the skin. And then we have an external reader that we power up the device wirelessly. There is a tiny antenna on chip, and then we also wirelessly communicate with the device. But that's a simpler device, just sensing one biomarker. But these neural interfaces are a lot more complex. There are many number of electrodes that we are sampling at relatively high rate. So the power consumption is higher, but our goal is to bring it so low that we can perform wireless power delivery.
Oh, all right. And then this is one I'll admit I hadn't thought of, but how do you ensure data privacy for patients? Because in a way you are kind of gathering information about their thoughts.
That's also a great question. And so in this, so the nice thing is that when you are doing wireless power or data in such a near field, somebody really needs to be very close to be able to do it. Unless you're sending the information to another device, which is not necessary eventually. If you're building a closed loop system, everything is contained. But definitely that's the concern that we need to all pay attention to. Overall, when we are generating data that are individual data sets, we have to be careful about it. It's not my area of research, but there are a lot of researchers that are looking into different ways of doing secure also computation on chip and hardware security and things like that that can be added to these devices in the future. But kind of you're moving step by step. At the very beginning, we just want to solve the problem and then later on handle the privacy aspect of it, either ourselves or hand it over to others to do it.
Makes sense. To go back to your work on seizures, is your work currently being used clinically for diagnosis or treatment of seizures?
So the work was continued by my, so the work here was done in collaboration or partly by one of my former postdocs, Mahsa Shuaran, and she moved to EPFL and she continues working on that seizure detection. She's working with a hospital over there and she has been using further human data to make this a reality. So they have done animal tests using a learning-based system for seizure detection. So we have done also additional collaborations with EPFL, but in terms of studies that we have done at Caltech, it was mainly in mice.
Makes sense. It's on the march toward making it to the clinic. Let's see. Do you feel that data and research for technologies like this that have the potential to benefit a lot of people ought to be open source, and to what extent are they already?
Yeah, definitely. I think nowadays there is, in fact, NIH has requirements and encourages people to create open access data source. Of course, the identity of the patients will not be associated to these data sources. A lot of people nowadays share their codes online. A lot of places that we publish, they encourage us to make the codes available. So there is a huge movement that has been encouraged by the government, by different researchers and publication agencies to share data and codes as much as possible. So this is already happening and will happen more and more in the future.
Peering a little bit into the future, do you see a world in which doctors rely more on artificial intelligence and on data gathered from medical devices and implantables and wearables than they do on listening to what the patient themselves actually says?
I think so. So there are actually areas that we believe it will make a huge difference. So I have a collaboration with Professor Vega. Professor Vega is another Caltech faculty member. He's using wearable sensors and measuring different biomarkers in sweat. So we've been collaborating together, but he is focusing on even trying to combine different biomarkers to evaluate things that are related to mental health, depression, anxiety. So these are areas that sometimes people with severe cases have difficulty maybe explaining it, or maybe they're not as much open about it, or tracking it is difficult for them. So definitely for things that are related, issues that are related to mental health, this would be significant. One of the promises of, again, precision medicine would be, instead of people, there are so many different, for instance, antidepressants and different drugs out there that they have a lot of side effects. Sometimes they work on a patient, sometimes they don't. And patients have to go through a period of trying a drug for at least a few months to determine, okay, it doesn't work. And now they have to switch to another drug. And imagine if we have all sort of these kind of measurements from many patients and correlated with what kind of psychotherapy or drugs work on them, we can bypass all these try and error and create a much faster path to better therapy.
All right. I'd be willing to bet there are some Caltech students watching, and maybe high school students who might want to come to Caltech. What kind of background would a student need to pursue to get involved in this kind of research? What would you recommend they study and get good at?
Sure. So I think, first of all, being good in math and science always is a must.
Never hurts.
So for instance, my group, we do a combination of hardware, software design. So we would like students to have a very strong background in math and physics in particular, and then they can learn the neuroscience and biology side of it, not as deeply, but in collaboration with other groups. And then be passionate about engineering and building things and looking into fundamentals of engineering systems. It can be in electrical engineering, chemical engineering, bioengineering. So these are areas that would be helpful for medical devices. My group is kind of rooted in electrical engineering, and we use electrical engineering principles for medical problems.
Okay. And to that end too, how easy or difficult has it been to find students to recruit for your lab to get involved in this research?
That's a great question. In fact, I find out that the students really are interested in this domain, because this is an area that they can relate to. They see the impact of it. In fact, I started as a more traditional electrical engineer at Caltech. I worked on high-speed data communication systems, computing systems, and so on. And I have continued that research, but gradually I get more and more students who are interested in medical devices. And they're so passionate because they find multidisciplinary research more rewarding. They learn from other groups in chemistry, biology, neuroscience. So so far has been fantastic. So we get a lot of students who are interested, a lot of undergraduate students are interested in my lab. And every year I have 4 or 5 undergraduate students who do their SERF, which is a summer research program at Caltech. And they work closely with my graduate students and postdocs.
Well, that's fantastic. All right. Well, I'm looking at the time, and it looks like we're about done here. So Azita, thank you so much for being here today.
Of course, my pleasure. It was very nice talking to you and being able to answer the questions from the audience.
Fantastic. And to that end, thanks for everyone for joining us. Next up in the conversation series on April 14th, we're going to talk to Professor Fernando Brandao about building a quantum computer. And on April 24th, we're going to hear from computer vision expert Pietro Perona and graduate student Suzanne Stethos about using AI for wildlife conservation. So go to scienceexchange.caltech.edu/conversations for more information, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.